In this video, we're going to assemble this PT-17. If you watched my previous video on unboxing the PT-17 and examining the parts, you're going to have an understanding of what's coming up in this assembly video. So before we get started, let me remind you that if you find this video helpful, please click the thumbs up button below the video and subscribe to the RCPlaneviews.com channel. Click the bell icon to be notified when I post new videos. So let's get the airplane out of the box, set it up so we have access to the parts, and start the assembly. Well, I've got the model parts laid out here in the workshop so I can get access to them without damaging them here as I put the airplane together. And I've reviewed the instructions. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is put on the decals. Especially on a biplane, it can be difficult to get to some of the sides and surfaces of the airplane to do after the airplane is assembled. So we're going to do that first. Now, I really like Dynam decals. I explained that in the previous video. So in the application of those decals, here's how I go about it. First, I cut out the decals from the main sheet. I get fairly close to the decals themselves and cut them out with the numbers included in that piece. After that, I pull off the extra vinyl, and if there are a lot of decals, I'll put the decal number on the backer paper so I can keep track of what's what. With this airplane, there are just a handful of decals, and so that wasn't necessary. The next step is to cut the backer paper fairly close to the decals, and I pull off the vinyl off that backer paper except for the decal because it can be kind of a pain to cut with scissors because they really are good decals. The next thing then I'm going to do is to apply the decals to the surface of the plane, and I'm going to demonstrate that with one of the smaller decals on a tail surface. I use this same technique, whether it's a big decal, a big roundel, something that goes the full length of the fuselage regardless of the size of the decal. This technique will work, and I recommend it to you. So here we're going to be applying the tail decal, the tail number here across, and we see from the instruction that it runs right along the bottom of a panel line. So we're going to get that laid out to make sure that it fits. We've got good spacing, and then we see here that we're going to be covering the hinge line. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull back the decal from the backer paper, and I'm only going to take about a half an inch maybe, and I'm just going to clip the backer paper off right there. Okay, so now I've got a little bit of the decal stickiness open, and so I'm going to place the decal against that line, and I'm going to cover it, the hinge line, and then I'm going to work the side to side to get the two where I want it, and then I'm going to push the two down. At that point then, I'm simply going to run my finger along the decal and fold this backer paper back, and then just run the decal along the line. And you can see then that the adhesive is really never exposed except for just a second before it goes onto the airplane. And so when you have a decal that spans the hinge line like that, as you can see, I've got a hobby knife here, and I'm just going to go underneath that decal and split it kind of right in the middle. A good sharp hobby knife is best. Okay, and then I can bend the hinge, get access to my big fat fingers, and just kind of lay that vinyl down on the inside of the hinge. And there I've got the decal mounted on the line. It's straight, and then I'm just going to run my fingers over it like this to make sure I get as good contact with the foam as I can with the adhesive there on the back of the decal. So I'm going to go off camera here and finish up the decals. They all going to work the same way, and we'll take a look at some of those when we get back. So here you can see that I have the decals on the model. I used the technique I just described, and it worked really pretty slick. You can see here that the decals are bright and colorful. We've got the roundels here. Again, with roundels, make sure that you're paying attention. So you've got the star pointed toward the front of the wing. Here on the lower wing, you can see that the star is pointed forward. You've got the aileron servo and the aileron on the back of the wing, and the point of the star is pointing forward. And then here on the fuselage, we've got the tail number here on the nose. I guess you'd call it the nose number. And then the side decals. Now, the side decals worked kind of cool, but there was also something that I need to point out to you. So when you do the technique that I described, you can set the decal so that the black and white are lined up on the edge of this red. When you get that down, you can lay down the sticky part of the decal and then peel it back just the way I showed you a moment ago. Now, what I discovered is that either the red is a little too narrow or the decal is a little too big. So when we get down here, this decal was made with the V and the Y white, which you would expect because you'd like, as you did with the number, you'd have white numbers. Well, that wouldn't fit. And so I used a Sharpie here on the N and then placed that decal there so that the Y is showing white, and then I filled in the one leg of the V of the Navy with a Sharpie. I probably could have used like some black auto pinstripe tape to do that, but this turned out okay. Now here on the other side of this model, the same thing occurred, in which case I just covered in the V and the Y with my Sharpie and mounted it, because when they printed the decal for the other side, they just duplicated it. And of course, if you're reading from left to right, what should have happened is that the U and maybe part of the S should have been white. So that's a failure in the printing. I suppose if you don't use English as your primary language, some of that stuff might escape you. And so let me flip this just real quick and you can see how that decal was applied. So you can see back here, it's got the US just after the red, and then over here the V and the Y. Again, I colored in those white letters with a Sharpie, and it looks pretty good. So all in all, I'm happy with the decals. They're good Dynam decals as always. However, this little production problem in terms of left and right is something that they need to take a look at. Okay, the instructions call for doing some things with the fuselage first, but I think I'm going to go into the assembly for the wings because I like to give the glue some time to set up. So this is the bottom wing. You can see I've got the wires taped up away from where I'm going to be gluing just to keep them out of the way. I've dry fit them already, so I know that they fit tight. And I have the spar here, and I have put the spar down through the hole, so I know that the holes are all clear. So I've done that. So now it's just a matter of applying some glue. I'm going to use the kit glue. Again, if you watch my other video, you know I've used that before, and it seems to work pretty good. So I'm going to puncture the top with the little pointy thing in the cap, and then I'm going to apply the glue. Now this is contact cement. If you have a favorite brand of contact cement, feel free to use it. They all work pretty much the same. I've had good success with the Dynam brand. So that's what I'm going to use here since I'm reviewing a Dynam model. So let's start by putting on the glue, and we're just going to apply it here to the tabs and the surfaces. Try to stay away from the edges. We can get a little closer to those here in just a second. So we've got this one done. The edges of the tab. And then the bottom edge of that tab is not going to be, on this wing anyway, is not going to be covered with anything, so we won't put any glue down there. I've got a little epoxy brush here, and so I'm just going to spread this glue out so that I have a nice smooth surface on everything. Okay, there's one wing done. Go through the same process here on this one. This side has got the cutouts for the tabs from the other side. So we'll get some glue in there, pile it up a little bit. And then again, I'm going to use this epoxy brush and get that all smoothed out so I've got a nice surface. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two parts of the wing and I'm going to push them together, wiggle them around. Oh, that's a nice good seal. That's good. And then I'm going to pull it apart, and you can see all those threads of glue, which means it's starting to get tacky, which is exactly what I want. And so at this point, I would normally just wait, 1 to 2 minutes and push it all together. But I have the spar to put in, so while that's getting tacky, I'm going to put some glue on the spar and get the spar into the hole of one half of the wing. So we'll do that here. Again, we'll use my brush here and smooth that out. Got glue on most of the surface of the spar. By making that thin, it really helps the glue to start to cure and become tacky much quicker. So we got it in there, and so now we're going to move it into the wing. Pushing pretty hard here to get it in there because of all that glue. So I've got it about halfway in there. It took the whatever curve there was in the wing out, so that's a very nice straight wing here, if you can see that right here. Get it in the camera right there. It's a nice looking wing. Now, next part then is I'm going to flip this around and go after the glue on the other side of the spar. Kind of smooth that glue out with my brush. And now I've been at this for, a couple minutes. And so I should be ready to completely blend these two together. Now, because the glue on the foam has been sitting a while, you don't have an awful long time to get the adjustments made. So you can see I've got it all there. I've got just about a 3/4 of an inch to go. And so this last 3/4 of an inch I'm going to push together quite abruptly and firmly, because as these foam pieces touch, they're going to stick. It's contact cement. And some pressure on that. Again, I'm trying to get the spar in that all the way, because the spar and the space for the spar is pretty exactly cut. And so I don't want the spar pushing away. So at this point, we've got this glue down, and we've got just a little bit further to push together as this comes and gets tacky and fits. So here with the upper wing, we're going to be gluing in the spar and then also covering it with this cover that covers the connection point. Now, I mentioned in the unboxing that I ended up with 2 spars. One came in the landing gear bag, the other was loose in the box. I've checked them out, and they're both the same. Now, I can also see that there is a piece of carbon fiber on end here that becomes the spar to this top end. So there's going to be some strength, even though the main part of the spar we're about to install only covers the middle portion of the wing. So this is the spar we have. And what we're going to do is we're going to put glue in the channel for the spar and then slide the spar in. We're going to do that on both sides, and then we're going to twist it around a little bit as opposed to putting glue on the spar itself. So we've got the glue out. Let's get some glue in that channel. Now, I'm not going to do both channels because we're going to have to get the glue on the end point surfaces of the wing. So we're just going to do this first one first, spin it around, get some glue on it, and we've got it in place very nicely right there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to put some glue here on the ends and glue in this channel to get that all together. So let's go after the ends right now. With the brush. And like before, we're going to push it together and pull it apart and let it tack up a little bit. And now we'll just wait. Okay, so it's been about 2 minutes. The glue has gotten tacky, I suspect. So we'll get that spar through the little loop there. We'll push this together. And this last little bit, as we did with the top wing, we're going to come together in a hurry, and we're going to get this in there, because once we get it in there, we don't have a lot of time to mess around before it sticks. Now, the last thing we need to do on this upper wing is to put this little wing cover on. And I found that it was bent just a little bit. It's a thin piece of foam, so that's not really surprising. And so just by applying a little bit of pressure on the foam, I can kind of bend it and take that warp out of it. It didn't amount to much, but there was a bit of it. And then I do the same thing on the long edge, because it is, the bottom side of the wing, and the wing has a bit of a curve to it. So I've got that looking pretty straight. I notice that there's a channel here for the spar, so that needs to match when you put it down. So you don't try to put it in backwards. It isn't going to fit. So what I did is I dry fitted it, and then I took my Sharpie and I put just a dot right here and a dot on the wing, so that after I've got it all covered in glue, I don't get discombobulated and try to put it on backwards. So the next thing I'm going to do then is to cover these surfaces with glue, brush it smooth, put it on, take it off, and then put it on for good. So let's do that right now. Next, the same glue here on the top piece. Okay, now I make sure I've got my dot lined up here, and we'll get it in there, squish it around. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get it out, which is what I normally do with contact cement, but that's okay, because we've got a nice smooth surface, and we've got it as we brushed it in, and it's already started to tack. So yeah, it's just going to go in because it is nice and snug. It's going in there just the way I want it. And so I'm not going to do that pull it out thing with this piece, because I don't want to mar the foam along one or the other of the edges. So let's take a few minutes and put on the control horns before we mount the empennage structure. All of the control horns come in a bag with their screws. And one of the things we want to watch out for is that we get the control horn on the correct side. So taking a look at the fuselage, the control horn, or the control rod with clevis coming from the rudder servo, is on the left side. So on this one, we're going to put the control horn on the left side. And then you want to watch the same thing here on the elevator. You can see there's a spar on the bottom of the elevator. So that'll be your clue to where that is. And so these control horns then are going to go on the bottom, because that's where the control rods are coming out of the fuselage. So that's what we're going to be up to here for a second. Let's work on the rudder first. Now, one of the things I like to do is I like to put just a little drop of glue on each side where I'm going to put the control horn to make sure that it stays attached even though it is screwing through the foam. And so I've got a drop of glue there. Again, remember that we've got the control horn is going to go on the left side, and it matches the holes that are already molded in right here. And so we're just going to stick that on right there, squish it around a little bit. Then we're going to go to the back side. We're going to match the holes in the plate with the holes in the foam, just like that. And then we're going to drop the screws through those holes. And then use the screwdriver that came with the kit while holding the plate on the underside right here. I'm just going to screw these in. You can wiggle these around as necessary to get it to bite on the other side of the rudder assembly, but we've got those in there. And so now I'm going to do that with the other control horns on the elevator. Now that we've got the control horns on the flight controls, we're going to get ready to mount the empennage. And the empennage, the horizontal stabilizer just kind of fits in that saddle, and it slides the little hole and the square blocks fit together, and then it slides under the turtle deck right here. We're just going to push that on. And as I think I've mentioned to you before, I like models where these things screw in, and this particular model, the empennage screws on. Down over here, I've got a couple of the screws that we're going to be using. I took my ruler out and measured them. They're 2.5 by 25 millimeters, and they've got kind of a wood screw as opposed to a machine screw end to them, so they're pointy there. And so we're going to go in from the bottom and screw them into the receivers. Keep in mind you're screwing into plastic, so you don't want to really cinch these down too tight for fear of stripping the plastic receiver. Screw in here. Screw in there. And we'll see if my kit provided screwdriver will reach all the way in there, and it does. Screwing that down. And get that screwed in there just like that. So now we've got the tail bolted onto the back of the model. So since we're at the back of the fuselage, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the tail wheel out of its little plastic bag of parts, and it's going to fit into a little collet right there. And then you note that there's a flat spot marked right there on the tail wheel. So that's going to do two things. One, it's going to give the grub screw something nice to mount against, and then it's going to allow us the opportunity to put it in there properly aligned. Now on this side of the little fairing that's around the tail wheel, there is a hole molded into the foam, and using the Allen key that came with the kit, you can go in there and access the grub screw that is mounted in the collet that will tighten this thing down. So I've loosened it already to allow me to slide the tail wheel into place, and then now I'm just going to tighten it. Got that nice and snug. Tail wheel isn't going to come out, and so now we've got the tail wheel mounted, and it's time to move to the main landing gear. Okay, so it's time for the main landing gear, and it fits right snugly into this plastic molded part right here, and you can see that it fits in there, and then it's held on with screws. And so we've got this plastic plate that fits over it. Now on the instructions it says they are 3 millimeter by 6 millimeter screws, and as it turns out they're the little black ones that are in the kit, so they're pretty small. But there's 10 of them, and we're just going to get them mounted in there. Use the Phillips screwdriver that comes with the kit. Get them in there. So I've got all of these screws tightened down. Just a little pointer or a tip. When you get the first couple of screws in, take a look to make sure you've got this mounted correctly. I didn't. I had to take it out and flip it to get the holes to line up. And then remember that these are sharp little screws screwing into plastic. So you want to make sure they're tight and snug, but you don't want to over tighten them for fear of stripping the plastic receiver. Now for the strut skirts, they don't take a lot of pressure. There's going to be some wind pressure against them, but I'm going to put a little bit of glue, just a couple of drops of glue right here to hold them on. I'm not going to do a lot of gluing here in case there's something that I need to do in terms of taking the landing gear off. So just enough to hold them on is what I'm going to be doing. So I'll put some of this contact cement there. Then I'm going to put a little here on the top using, kind of that same glue technique that I've talked about before. So then with the little peg facing forward, just going to place this onto the strut and then slide that in there like I've done before. Let it hang out and let that glue start to cure a little bit. Again, sliding it underneath the support, that metal support. Get it in there. Slide it back out. Let that sit for a minute or two, and then slide them in and stick them together. Now, as you can see, I've got the wheels on. I've got them out of the package they came from. Just a couple of little tips and pointers on that. The hubs on the wheels, come in two parts. They're put together, and so sometimes they don't completely align. And so they were a little hard to get over the edge of the axle here. And so I used a little needle round file and just filed out the center of that a little bit, and you can see it spins very nicely right there. Just be advised, occasionally it's going to be a tight fit. The other thing to note is that when these are cut, sometimes there's just a little edge on the end of the axle, and a little time with a file on the end can take that down too, which is sometimes what causes the tires to kind of get stuck when you're putting them on. So a little bit of filing on the inside of the wheel, a little bit of filing on the axle, and you can get them on just fine. Now the wheel collet I have here, and I have the grub screw painted up. So right where I'm pointing is where the grub screw is. And because landing gear take a lot of vibration when you're taxiing, certainly when you're landing, I usually use a little bit of the medium strength thread locker on the grub screw so that they don't back out. You can still take them out, but they're less likely to vibrate out. And if you add that as part of your pre-flight, if you notice that they're starting to get loose, the grub screw isn't going to vibrate loose and then come out and fall away. Let's talk a little bit about what's probably the most complicated part of this assembly. It's not difficult, it's just there's a lot of opportunities to make mistakes. And so let's talk a little bit about this before we go to mounting the bottom wing to the fuselage. Now, the flying wires are a very nice scale touch. You normally don't find them on models of this size and price range, so that's very cool. Now, the thing about the flying wires that you need to be aware of is that there are actually 3 different lengths. And so, as you can see, I've got the instructions here. I made ample use of the drawing, number 5, where it describes these things. And so, the wires coming from the top wing, and this is the bottom side of the top wing, when it comes from the outside strut here, these wires are somewhere in the neighborhood of 420. What does it say here? It says it's 426.9 millimeters. Okay, and so there are 2 of those on each end. So there's 4 total of those 426.9 millimeter wires. Now, coming from the top, from the inside cabane, there are 2 flying wires, and the one in the back is 357.9, and the one in the front is 363. And so it's probably not important that you measure them, but it is important that you sort them and label them so you get the right wire on the right screw head as we put this model together. So that's something to pay attention to. It took a while to get them all unwrapped and sorted and so forth, but taking a few extra minutes to do that is certainly worth the trouble. Now, I mentioned early on that I was going to paint the struts and the cabanes. I did that. I just used some craft paint, and they're under the wings, and so, you know, you can see a little bit of brush marks, but it looks better than the silver metal. The other thing I did is we have these light wires that come down the cabane from the wing, and in that case what I did is I slid a piece of a heat shrink tubing down over the wing, and then heated that up a little bit, and it shrunk down over the wire, so now I'm not going to have that wire. You could use tape, you could use little wire ties, any number of things to keep that from flapping in the wind, but I chose the heat shrink. Be careful, I got just a little bit of bubbles where I let the heat get too hot next to the foam. So be mindful of that, learn from my mistake. So that's basically what we're looking at. Now here on the connecting these to the wings, there are 2.5 by 10 millimeter machine screws that are used to make those connections. There are a bunch of them in the small parts package, and they go together pretty easily. You know, they're small pieces. If you've got big fat fingers, you know, you may want to use something like this hemostat, a hobby hemostat, to hold the nut while you're finishing up the tightening process. But what I've got is the wires with the little connectors pointed up in the same direction as the cabane. I anticipate they're going to bend a little bit as I tighten them up, and that's okay. They're soft, flexible metal. So I've done that on both sides. The other thing I want to point out down here, again, according to the drawings and photos of the real airplane, this V on the top of the wing is in the back of the wing. So you want to be mindful of that so you don't get these on backwards. And then the other thing is in this front cabane, the one that's rearmost, the one that I've got the wire from the lights coming down, that is canted forward, and that's so that as the wing is mounted on the fuselage itself, what you'll be doing there is, in the full-scale airplane, giving the pilot room to get into that front cockpit. So take a couple of minutes, look at the drawings, look at the pieces, parts, and then this will go together, you know, pretty easily. Okay, so here we're ready to put the lower wing on. These are 2.5 by 25 millimeter screws, so they're not very big, but I've used these before on Dynam models. They seem to work pretty well to keep the wing on. One of the things to point out here, underneath the wing here are these two little tabs, and there are molds in the upper wing that will allow a little piece of foam to fit in there. So be careful, because these are, you know, they're not very thick, and foam is pretty flexible. So I'm going to be careful when I put the wing down on those so that I don't bend or break those off. They look like a potential problem there that I'm going to try to avoid. And then, because on the other side of this little battery tray, there's a drawing on the board that I think is a recommendation of where to put the receiver. So when I put the wires from the servos in, I'm going to go down the back side as opposed to down the front side. So let's get this wing ready to put on. This is the kind of the area where that spar goes, and so I want to be careful. And so I have my wing here, and I'm going to put the wires down the back. Kind of bend down and make sure that I don't catch those little front things to get that on nice and tight. So now I've got the screws in the little plastic sleeves, so it's time to screw them in, and hopefully the alignment will be good so that they'll go in. Again, I'm not getting them tight this time. I'm getting them all fitted first, and then I'll come back and tighten them in case I need to try to wiggle them around a little bit to get that little screw into the hole in the receiver in the fuselage. Now that alignment was perfect. Sometimes you have to shift the wing around a little bit or move these things because a 0.5 millimeter makes a difference. But these went in perfectly. So that's one of the smoother wing mounts I've done with Dynam planes, and it worked very, very nice. So now it's time to flip it over and attach the top wing. Okay, so let's talk flying wires for just a moment. As you can see, we've got the wings assembled now. And so let me just point out a couple of things. First, I started with these here, and I started right there and got these mounted first. Now, because these are hanging down, I put some shop rags over this so I didn't, while I was moving it, make a bunch of dents in the foam. So I'd recommend doing that. These again are just those same machine screws, and so we were just connecting them up and moving them over here. The screws over here are 2.5 by 8 millimeter screws, not machine screws. And when I measured them, they're all 10 millimeters. So don't let that fool you. Searching for 8 millimeter screws, they're 10. And so do measure so that you are getting the right ones in the right place, but they're simply mislabeled. They're used in a lot of places around the airplane, and so they've just got that same size. And so they just screw into plastic receivers on the side, and so that worked out really pretty well. When I put this upper wing on, I put the front wire on and then the back wire. Probably would have been easier to put the back wire on first, so the front wire wasn't in the way when I was trying to put the screw in, and so I offer that up. And then the other thing is on these wing struts, you need to be mindful that they have some bends on the ends and they have a slight inward cant to them. And so when you get the wing struts on properly, because if you just flip them over, you still get the V on the right side, but then the bends are wrong. And so I've got this set so that it's bending toward this one. This is a little inside, so it's bent this way. As you can see right here, and so they line up that way. The first time I tried it, I had put this one on backwards, so a quick removal of the screws, flipped it over, and it fit perfectly. So in fact, there's a front and a back to these, and there are a left and a right. They're not labeled, so you're just going to have to dry fit them so that you're happy with it before you cinch it all down. So the flying wires are a nice touch. They look nice. They're a little tedious to put on, but they're not difficult. So it's a very nice effect. So now it's time to turn to the back of the airplane and connect the flight controls to the clevises there on the rudder and the elevator. Okay, so we've got the rudder centered. I have a little servo tester that I put in the center mode, and so I've got them centered. And so now I'm just going to put the clevises on, and that's just a matter of spreading them apart a little bit with your fingers and then fitting them into the hole. So with the clevis through, we're going to put it through the top horn, and at this point I'm not going to close the clevis because I'm going to have some flight control adjustments yet to make, and I don't like to put a lot of stress on the little ball that holds those two clevises together, the two stirrup sides of the clevis together. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side of the airplane, away from the camera, get it into the hole, and I'm going to do the same thing for the rudder. Now, my tail wheel is a little off center, so what I'm going to do is go under there and center the tail wheel with the rudder arm, and then see where that puts this control arm. And so now it's just going to be a little experimenting to get those things straight. And when I get those done, then we'll come back and do the little spring supports on the horizontal stabilizer. Now the last thing we've got to do here on the back of the airplane is to put in the supports for the horizontal stabilizer, and that's done with just, you know, 2 little springs. And so I'm going to hook the wire over one of the little springs here. They're pretty loose. And then this spring has a gap on it right here. Hopefully you can see it. And it's just going to hook into this little plastic catch right there. And then now I've got another spring here, and I'm going to hook that on the open end of this wire. Now the springs are different. One has got a closed, pretty much closed end. That is one I'm going to put on the wire support, and then one's got an open end that I'm going to slide into the receptacle there. And so that'll give it a little support. There are 4 of them, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. So I'm going to work on those other 3. They're going to go on exactly the same way. So I'm going to point out a couple of little things here in the interior of the airplane. Depending on the radio and the receiver and so forth that you're using, this may be different. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here. Just point out the basics. I've got the aileron Y cord that came with the airplane, and it's connected to the ailerons coming up through the back access area. From the bottom wings, I've got the rudder, elevator, and throttles all connected here. And then I plug the Dynam light controller in on the gear channel, since we're not going to be messing with landing gears, fixed gear. That light controller I have kind of up here. And I chose to make the navigation light steady as opposed to flashing. This light controller can control, I think, about 5 lights. There's only 2 on this airplane, so I have several open flashing outputs from that light controller. The XT60 from the speed control is right there. The battery is right here. And then I'm using an MSR66A receiver from Detrum. I like these little receivers. They're a sport receiver, they're full range, and they have a built-in stabilizer which you can access through the programming on the radio. In this case, I am using the Detrum Blitz DT9 radio. I programmed that up here off camera, and I've got all of the flight controls going the right direction. Had to reverse a couple of the servos, you know, that kind of thing. And then because there are many connectors here on the inside, it makes getting alignment of the tail, the empennage, the rudder, and the elevators really easy. You just loosen this screw and then pull the wire in or out a little bit to make the alignment perfect. And then you can see here, I've got the MSR66 located facing forward. There's a little icon on it that faces forward. I've told the radio, you know, that it's facing right side up, facing forward, and there's a little area embossed there on that plywood shelf to place the radio receiver. So there's plenty of room in there for a variety of battery sizes, so I can shift the battery around to get the proper center of gravity. Now the last thing I want to show you is the lid for this hatch, and I put a pilot in. I like airplanes that fly with pilots, and so I had one laying around the shop. He was just a little too wide. I used a hobby knife here and here and carved out just a little pocket of foam underneath there. And then when I put him in sideways and just spun him into place with a little drop of glue there in the back to hold him tight. So now I've got a pilot on the aircraft. The hatch is ready to go. And aside from putting on the propeller and checking the center of gravity, I think I've just about got this thing complete. Okay, so the propeller should go on pretty easy. It's a big Dynam propeller. It's 13 by 6. It just fits onto the shaft. Now, some people talk about putting a little piece of sandpaper on there for better grip. We'll see how it works. If we can get it tight enough without doing that, that'll be good. Otherwise, we can go back and make a little circle of sandpaper so that we get a good grip on that. And then the washer and then the prop nut goes on top of that. We're going to screw that on. And so here we've got the prop, the washer, and the prop nut on the airplane. The washer there is a curved top, and this is a flat top. So again, I'm going to be checking on that to see whether that's something I want to keep that washer on or not. It just looks a little odd, but it came with it, so that's what I'm going to put on it. I tested the motor to make sure that it spun the right way while I was doing the electronics, and so I'm really done with the electronics and programming the radio now so that I can keep my prop on for my CG test. Normally the prop's the last thing I put on, regardless of what the instructions might show, because I don't want to inadvertently actuate some electronic command that causes it to spin. Now I've got two other little pieces to go, and these are these two little grab handles that are going to go here in the back of the airplane. So I'm going to put a drop of glue on those, put those on, and then we'll check the CG. Okay, so the instructions call for the CG to be 75 to 80 millimeters aft of the leading edge of this upper wing. And so I've made two little small dots right there at the 75 and 80 millimeter areas. And then I put in a 2650 4-cell LiPo battery. It calls for 2600, 2650 is what I had, so that's what I'm going to use. I have it all the way forward up against the little sponge mount that's right here in the front part of the that open cockpit section. And so let's pick it up and see how we do. Wait, let me try the one-hand approach so you might be able to see it better. Comes up and it balances. So I'm pretty happy with that. It's a good place to start. It's where the instructions call for. It's not going to be so out of whack that it'll crash, but I may have to make some fine adjustments after I get a couple of flights in on it. So at this point, I'm going to put some Velcro on the battery tray and to keep it where I want the battery to stay, along with the straps that came with the kit. And at that point, I think we'll declare victory. Well, as you can see, this is a very nice model, but let's go through a couple of closing comments here to give you some insights as to what I experienced and what you may want to watch out for. First, the fit and finish of the model was really good. I didn't have to do any cutting, any sanding, or anything. The pieces fit together exactly the way they were supposed to. So that was a very good thing. Now, one of the things that I did notice, though, is that I used the glue, and that's because I glued the two halves of the bottom wing together. That's not required. It's an option because the spar and two screws on each half of the wing connecting it to the fuselage. If you prefer not to glue the bottom wing together, you could probably do that just fine. I chose to glue it together, and so 3 tubes of glue was what I needed to complete the model. The flying wires are a very nice touch. It's important, though, to take a look at those small drawings on the instructions to make sure that you're getting the right wire at the right time. So again, I spent a couple of extra minutes sorting the wires out. There are 4 of the long ones, 2 medium and 2 short. If you get them divided that way, that's good enough. You don't have to measure out the exact number of millimeters in each wire. But it's important to know that the long wires are the ones that go from the top to the bottom of the fuselage, front and back on both sides. So there are 4 of those. And then the middle length wire goes from this upper cabane to the bottom in the front, and the shorter wire goes from the upper cabane in the back to this other side. So take a couple of extra minutes and make sure that you have the proper wires grouped together and labeled so that when you're ready to put them together, you get them together in the right place. I mentioned before that there's an up and down and a front and back to these struts, so be mindful of that. I ended up having to flip one. It took an extra minute, so it's not like a catastrophe, but it was just one of the things that you may want to be mindful of so you can avoid that frustration. I also put a pilot in the model. I had one laying around from actually from another Dynam kit, and so I was able to use that. I think he survived a crash at one time. The other thing I mentioned to you when I had the cockpit open that I thought was really good is that those little mini connectors making the final adjustments here on the flight controls on the tail very easy. So that worked out really slick. When I plugged the receiver in and had the initial programming with the radio done, popped the battery in, bound the receiver. These were off just a little bit, but it was a snap to arrange them so that they were perfectly aligned with the control surface and the structural surface itself. So that process worked really well. And the ailerons aligned well too when I got the radio connected. When they centered out, they both centered in the same place. Had to reverse servos, no big deal. That's not unusual, and that's going to depend upon the signal setup of the particular radio that you're using. I, again, was using the Detrum Blitz DT9, and so making those changes was easy, as was assigning a switch for the stabilizer that's built into the MSR66A receiver, which is what I chose to use. If you haven't chosen a receiver yet and you're flying Detrum radios, it's a great choice for this little airplane. So all in all, I have been very happy with it. Probably my biggest gripe with this model had nothing to do with the model itself, but the instructions. The instructions are made for someone who's built a couple of these already. If you have some experience, it's going to go together. It makes perfect sense. If you're a little bit newer to putting together these models, however, some of those diagrams are probably going to raise questions. And so you have a video like this one to help you work your way through the build process. There we are. I'm going to take this out. We'll do a video walk around out in the driveway. And again, as always, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up below the video and subscribe to the RC Plane Views channel. Click the bell icon to be notified when I post new videos. Thanks for watching.